People said the fire had been an accident. That was the version written into reports, repeated by officials, folded neatly into insurance settlements and forgotten within weeks. A wiring failure, unsafe conditions, an unfortunate chain of errors. No intent, no names, no responsibility. The kind of disaster that belonged to statistics, not to anyone who could be held accountable. Nora Blake had never believed that version. Even years later, the memory arrived without warning. The smell of burned plastic mixed with hot oil. The way heat pressed against skin not like chaos, but like purpose. The sound of metal gates slamming shut from the outside, deliberate and final. Men moving through smoke without panic, without urgency, covering angles, clearing space. Fire that did not spread randomly, but advanced in sections, as if following instructions. She had survived because someone had decided she should. That decision had followed her into every document, every room, every silence that surrounded her afterward. 10 years later, she lived inside the consequence of it. The house on the hill did not announce itself. It stood beyond the last polished neighborhoods, beyond the glass towers and renovated brick that sold the city as clean and ambitious. The road curved unnaturally as it climbed, breaking sightlines, slowing approach. At night, only a few lights burned, placed for coverage rather than comfort. No decorative gates, no signage, no visible cameras. The absence of display was intentional. Attention was a liability. Officially, the property belonged to a charitable foundation with a name designed to dissolve into paperwork. It funded veteran programs, community safety initiatives, quiet donations that made city councils cooperative. In practice, the house functioned as the central node of a private security network that existed where law enforcement hesitated. Port terminals, warehouse corridors, escort details for people whose problems never reached public courts. When order needed to be imposed without publicity, this house answered. Colt Hale had built that system piece by piece after the uniform stopped fitting. Once an officer, once someone who believed rules were complete, he had learned their limits the hard way. He no longer wore rank or insignia, but people still referred to him as general in conversations meant to stay private. His power was not loud. It moved through contracts, indemnity clauses, access permissions, and quiet understandings with officials who preferred stability to transparency. He did not dominate rooms through presence alone. He controlled them through anticipation. When Colt Hale entered a space, conversations adjusted instinctively, as if people were aligning themselves with an unseen structure. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely explained himself. His authority lived in the way others recalculated around him. Inside the house, nothing felt accidental. Rooms were spacious but stripped of unnecessary objects. Furniture was arranged for movement, not comfort. Hallways were wide, corners softened, sightlines preserved. Even the upper floor, where his mother lived under constant care, felt less like a home and more like a controlled environment disguised as gentleness. That was where Nora belonged, at least on paper. Her designation was simple: household assistant, part-time caregiver. She managed schedules, prepared meals, monitored medication, kept the upper level orderly. To visitors, she appeared quiet, efficient, easily overlooked. A girl who had been fortunate enough to land somewhere stable after a damaged youth. Within the system that surrounded the house, she did not exist. Her records were immaculate in a way that made careful people uneasy. Birth certificates reconstructed without gaps. Educational history retroactively completed. Medical files assembled with precision but no depth. No listed relatives. No next of kin. No loose threads that could pull back toward the past. Nora understood what that meant. She had been rewritten. After the fire, she had not been saved. She had been preserved. Someone had decided her survival might be useful later and had cleaned her identity accordingly. She had no surname that carried weight, no family that could ask questions, no history that demanded explanation. She lived inside proximity because distance would have erased her. Nora remembered the factory as clearly as if it still burned. The illegal operation on the city's industrial edge, staffed by people who never appeared on payrolls long enough to matter. She remembered hiding behind machinery, lungs tearing, vision blurring, waiting for chaos that never came. Instead, order arrived. Men in masks. Controlled movement. Clearance, not rescue. When she was pulled out, it had not been with urgency. It had been with assessment. She had seen the insignia then, stamped on equipment cases and jackets, faint but unmistakable. Years later, she saw it again on documents that passed briefly through the house, marked in corners no one expected household staff to notice. That was why she believed Colt Hale was responsible. Not because she needed a villain, but because his people had been there. Because the same quiet authority that ruled this house had once decided a factory, and everyone inside it could disappear. Nora stayed because revenge required proximity. She moved through the house carefully, learning its rhythms. She counted steps between rooms, memorized which doors were always unlocked because they never needed to be forced. She noted guard rotations, the difference between men assigned to protect and men assigned to observe. She learned when the house slept and when it only pretended to. She watched Colt Hale without ever letting him see her watching. He noticed everything, but he did not notice everything the same way. He assessed threats, leverage, patterns. Nora was none of those on the surface. She was useful labor, a variable that had already been accounted for. Family dynamics added another layer of risk. Ryan Hale, Colt's nephew, operated as the public face of legitimacy. Where Colt avoided visibility, Ryan cultivated it. He attended charity functions, sat on advisory boards, spoke about modernization and transparency with practiced ease. He talked about legacy as if it were a neutral concept, something that could be managed rather than survived. Ryan paid attention to Nora in a way that felt deliberate. He framed it as concern, as opportunity. He spoke of stability, formal arrangements, contracts that could secure her position permanently. He suggested futures that sounded generous but carried weight, obligations that would bind her to the family structure in ways she would not be able to undo. To Ryan, Nora was not a person with unresolved history. She was an element that needed to be settled before it destabilized something larger. Colt allowed those interactions to continue without interference. That silence was not indifference, it was calculation. The moment that fractured the equilibrium arrived disguised as routine. A closed gathering filled the house under the banner of donor appreciation. The guests were people whose names rarely appeared in public records, whose influence traveled through boards and committees rather than headlines. Nora moved through the periphery, collecting glasses, straightening papers, doing the work that rendered her invisible. Late in the evening, she entered a side office to retrieve a misplaced folder. The door had been left slightly open. Inside, a desk terminal glowed softly. An email thread remained visible, paused mid-scroll, as if its reader had believed privacy was guaranteed by status alone. Nora recognized the structure immediately. Logistics language masking intent. Dates aligned too cleanly. References to subcontractors she had seen before, buried inside charitable expense reports. Then she saw the attachment. A scanned approval bearing the same insignia burned into her memory. Rooted through shell entities. Authorized not as an operation, but as clearance. Removal presented as risk mitigation. The factory fire had not been negligence. It had been permission. Nora did not read every line. She did not need to. She memorized enough to understand that survival had never been accidental. Footsteps approached. She closed the file without altering its alignment and returned the folder to its place. Her pulse remained steady. She had waited too long for confirmation to panic now. Standing in the hallway afterward, the house felt different. It was no longer shelter, nor prison. It was a structure built on decisions that burned quietly and erased efficiently. Leaving without consequence was impossible. Whatever had spared her once had not been mercy. It had been utility. And utility, once questioned, was often eliminated. The house on the hill remained silent, its lights steady against the night. Inside it, a girl without a surname finally understood exactly where the fire had started and why it had been allowed to burn. The attack did not feel like chaos. It arrived with precision, with the kind of timing that only existed inside systems where everyone knew their place and someone had decided to shift it. The evening had unfolded according to routine. Controlled movement, minimal staff, a reduced perimeter justified by a false sense of internal security. The house on the hill was quieter than usual, its corridors dimmed, its exterior deliberately unremarkable. Colt Hale left the lower wing shortly after midnight. He did not rush. He never rushed. The driveway curved downward just enough to conceal blind spots, engineered long before for reasons that were no longer documented. The car waited where it always did. The driver was one of his oldest people, someone whose loyalty had been tested through years of mutual compromise. The first shot came from inside the perimeter. It was clean, deliberate, aimed to incapacitate rather than execute, a professional's choice. The bullet tore through Colt's side, fracturing rib, collapsing breath, forcing his body to acknowledge vulnerability it had long been trained to ignore. The second shot never came. The silence afterward was louder than gunfire. For exactly 40 seconds, one camera on the west corridor stopped recording. That detail would matter later. Security reacted quickly, but not quickly enough. Too many steps were taken in the wrong order. Too many protocols were followed with suspicious obedience. Someone had known which lever to pull, which pause to create. Colt did not lose consciousness. Pain narrowed his world to sharp increments. The ground felt cold beneath him. The sky above the hill was empty of stars, washed out by city glow. He registered movement, boots, voices blurred into function rather than meaning. His hand pressed instinctively against the wound, blood warm and excessive. Then Nora was there. She had not been meant to be. She had followed the sound not out of instinct, but calculation. Gunfire in that house was never random. It was always an announcement. When she saw him on the ground, blood dark against tailored fabric, the decision arrived faster than thought. This was the moment she had imagined. She had rehearsed it in silence for years. The opportunity to let him bleed, to step back and let the system he built consume him, to call no one and disappear into the confusion. She did none of those things. She dropped beside him, fingers already pressing where they should not have known to press. She tore fabric without hesitation, ignoring the heat of blood against her skin. Her movements were efficient, practiced in a way that betrayed a past no one had officially recorded. She did not look at his face. She focused on breath, on pulse, on buying time. The choice did not absolve him. It did not soften her conclusions. It only complicated them. They moved him before anyone outside the inner circle arrived. A service entrance. A secondary vehicle. No hospital, no emergency dispatch. The house sealed itself behind them with mechanical obedience. Gates closed. Phones were restricted. Access lists rewritten in real time. Inside, the structure shifted. People changed positions without being told. Rooms were reassigned. Security teams were replaced quietly. The atmosphere thickened, not with panic but with anticipation. Someone had acted. That meant someone else would move next. Nora stayed. She should not have been allowed to. Anyone else would have been removed, questioned elsewhere, made to disappear into procedure. But she was already there when the damage had been done, hands stained, presence unavoidable. The doctor arrived, under a confidentiality clause older than the house itself. Colt survived surgery, but not without cost. The wound was severe enough to threaten organ damage, controlled only by speed and experience. The night stretched into something intimate and exhausting, measured in breaths and silent adjustments. Nora saw him then without structure. Not as the man whose name quieted rooms, but as a body resisting failure. Sweat beaded along his temple. His jaw clenched reflexively. Control fractured in brief moments he could not suppress. It did not make him sympathetic. It made him real. That realization unsettled her more than hatred ever had. By dawn, the house was fully awake in its own silent way. Ryan Hale arrived with precision. He expressed concern exactly where it was expected, with the right pauses, the right gravity. He took charge of visible processes, coordinated staff, reassured donors who had already begun calling under the guise of worry. His involvement appeared generous, necessary, responsible. To Nora, it looked rehearsed. Ryan moved as if this crisis had been accounted for, as if contingency plans had already been drafted. His eyes lingered on Colt longer than needed, assessing not health but outcome. His attention toward Nora sharpened, not with suspicion, but with interest. She understood then that the attack was not an external threat. It was an internal correction. When Colt regained full awareness, the house was no longer the same. Pain sharpened his perception rather than dulling it. He felt the altered weight of the air, the recalculated distances between people. He knew immediately that security had failed by design. He also knew that Nora had not left. He kept her close. Not as punishment, not as mercy, as necessity. She was the only constant in a sequence that had been disrupted. The only person present before and after the breach. The only witness to the moment when his control had been physically challenged. He did not hand her over to authorities because authorities were embedded in his system. He did not release her because she now knew where the fractures lay. They existed in a forced proximity neither of them had planned. Nora felt the pressure immediately. Her movements were observed more carefully. Her access narrowed in subtle ways. She was not confined, but she was contained. Every choice she made now carried consequence. Colt did not accuse her. That restraint was deliberate. He watched instead. He measured her reactions, her stillness, her refusal to appear afraid. He saw the contradiction, a woman who believed him responsible for her past, yet had chosen to keep him alive. That contradiction became the first crack in a narrative both of them had relied on. For Nora, the night destroyed the simplicity of revenge. She had expected him to be untouchable, abstract, a symbol rather than a man. Seeing him bleed did not absolve him, but it exposed layers she had not planned for. The system was not as monolithic as she had believed. It was vulnerable to internal betrayal. For Colt, the night confirmed what he had long suspected. The threat was not outside his empire. It was nested within it, protected by familiarity and legitimacy. The attack had not been meant to kill him outright. It had been meant to remind him that he could be reached. And Nora was now irreversibly part of that equation. By morning, the house returned to its quiet. The hill looked unchanged from the road. No sirens, no news, no visible damage. Inside, however, something fundamental had shifted. The fire that once defined Nora's past no longer belonged solely to memory. It had found a new shape, one that burned through loyalty, bloodlines, and control. The first shot had not been meant as an ending. It had been a message. And both of them now understood that whatever followed would not allow neutrality, distance, or clean exits. The house on the hill had cracked. Not visibly, but deeply enough to matter. The document arrived too cleanly. It did not appear through theft, coercion, or chance. It surfaced the way answers sometimes did when someone wanted a story to end neatly. Nora found it where she was meant to find it, packaged as certainty rather than discovery. A sealed folder placed among routine materials, its presence justified by procedure, its weight heavier than paper should have been. Inside was everything she had waited for. A contract bearing Colt Hale's name, formatted in the legal language she had learned to distrust. It referenced risk mitigation, asset containment, and third-party compliance. The phrasing was deliberate, precise enough to pass scrutiny, vague enough to hide intent. Attached was a cover letter, signed with his authorization, sanctioning an operation that aligned perfectly with the timeline of the factory fire. There was also a token. A security badge, scorched along one edge, its insignia unmistakable. The same symbol she had seen in the smoke years ago. The same shape that had followed her through nightmares and quiet moments of calculation. Someone had cleaned it, preserved it, and now presented it as evidence of guilt rather than survival. The combination was devastating. For Nora, it felt like closure masquerading as revelation. The kind of truth that promised resolution, that invited action rather than doubt. The anger she had kept restrained sharpened into something functional. Her movements became more rigid, her questions more pointed. She stopped pretending neutrality in Colt's presence. She began to provoke. Not recklessly, but with intent. She pressed at conversations, tested boundaries, introduced references that should not have existed unless he were responsible. She watched for reactions, for hesitation, for the fracture that would confirm what the document already claimed to prove. Colt noticed the shift immediately. He did not need to see the document to understand its effect. Nora's posture changed. Her silences gained weight. The way she watched him was no longer observational but anticipatory, as if she were measuring the distance between accusation and consequence. He did not confront her. That restraint was strategic. Instead, he felt the system closing around him. Pressure applied not through force, but through timing. Vendors delayed responses. A minor compliance review expanded unexpectedly. Access points he controlled began to require additional authorization. Someone was testing the edges of his authority while pretending it was coincidence. The document was not an attack on his reputation. It was bait. While Nora prepared to burn him publicly, the house itself was being destabilized from within. The same precision that had orchestrated the shooting now guided the flow of information. Someone wanted Colt isolated, reactive, forced into defense. The first crack appeared outside the house. Erin Murphy did not arrive with accusations. She arrived with questions disguised as audits. As a federal auditor assigned to review charitable foundations linked to private security initiatives, she moved through records with the patience of someone who understood that fraud rarely announced itself. She noticed inconsistencies immediately. Contractor registration numbers that did not align with the period they were supposed to exist. Insurance filings amended retroactively with justification codes that had only been introduced years later. Financial transfers routed through entities that appeared dormant at the time of the fire but showed activity in modern databases. The signature on the letter bothered her most. It matched Colt Hale's authorization style at first glance, but under magnification it fractured. Micro variations in pressure, inconsistent lift points. The kind of errors produced not by haste, but by imitation. Erin flagged the anomalies quietly. She did not report them upward yet. She understood the value of timing. Instead, she expanded her scope, tracing money flows backward rather than forward. The deeper she went, the clearer it became that the factory fire had been financially resolved years after it supposedly ended. Someone had been maintaining the lie. Nora learned of the audit by accident. A conversation overheard near the service corridor. a reference to an external review that did not match the house's internal schedule. The name registered vaguely at first, then sharpened as she connected it to the timing of the document's appearance. For the first time since receiving the contract, doubt intruded. Not enough to erase conviction, but enough to destabilize certainty. She began to notice details she had initially ignored: the freshness of the paper, the way the letterhead aligned with Colt's current branding rather than the older format used at the time, the unnatural completeness of the evidence. It felt curated. Colt chose that moment to shift his approach. He did not deny the document. He did not demand trust. He did not ask for patience. Instead, he began to expose infrastructure, not explanations, but systems. He allowed Nora to see parts of the financial architecture he had built, the redundancies, the legacy contracts that still bore traces of old decisions. He showed her roots, not conclusions. Transactions that proved someone else had benefited from the fire more directly than he had. Accounts that absorbed payouts he never touched. Shell companies that predated his restructuring of the security network, linked to individuals who now aligned publicly with Ryan's expansion plans. He never framed it as defense. He framed it as demonstration. The implication was clear without being spoken. If the document were genuine, it would fit into the existing structure seamlessly. Instead, it sat atop it, forcing alignment rather than revealing it. Nora did not accept his narrative. But she could no longer dismiss the possibility that the evidence had been engineered. The badge disturbed her most. It should not have survived the fire. She remembered how heat had warped everything, how metal had burned skin. The token in her hand was too intact, its damage too aesthetic, too symbolic. It felt less like an artifact and more like a message. Someone wanted her angry. Someone wanted her decisive. Colt recognized that too. He understood now that the document was not meant to convince him. It was meant to weaponize her, to push her into a final move that would expose him publicly while leaving the true architects untouched. The enemy was no longer theoretical. It was operational. Inside the house, alliances shifted subtly. Staff who had been loyal grew cautious. Information leaked in controlled fragments. Ryan's presence increased, his concern for Colt's recovery paired with quiet inquiries into asset control and succession planning. The war was no longer hidden. It was internal, surgical, and patient. Between Colt and Nora, something unstable formed. Not trust, not forgiveness, but alignment under pressure. They stood on opposite sides of belief, but shared a growing understanding that the truth was being manipulated through them rather than revealed to them. They did not agree on the past. They did not agree on guilt. But they agreed on one thing. The document that claimed to end the story had been designed to close the wrong truth. And whoever had created it was still inside the house, watching closely, waiting for one of them to make a mistake large enough to finish what the fire had started. The pressure did not arrive with threats. It arrived wrapped in language that sounded reasonable, even generous. Ryan Hale understood optics better than force. Where violence created noise, legitimacy created silence. He did not frame his approach as ownership. He framed it as rescue. Nora felt the shift before it was articulated. Her access changed subtly. Invitations appeared where there had been none before. She was asked to sit at tables rather than clear them, to attend meetings under the guise of transparency. People who had previously ignored her began to acknowledge her presence with calculated warmth. The house was rehearsing a new version of her. Ryan was at the center of it. He spoke of protection in institutional terms, legal insulation, public identity, a formal role that would remove her from vulnerability and place her inside the structure permanently. He presented options that appeared voluntary but were engineered to converge on a single outcome: A contract. Not a simple agreement, but a composite arrangement. Legal guardianship clauses, shared assets, non-disclosure obligations, public affiliation. Marriage was implied without being demanded outright, its absence allowing the illusion of choice. The effect would be the same. Her life would be absorbed into the Hale brand, sanitized, contextualized, explained. Her past would become a footnote managed by lawyers. The narrative was clean. A girl without history given stability by a powerful family. Gratitude expected. Silence assumed. Any future mention of the fire reframed as trauma-induced fixation, a symptom rather than an accusation. Ryan did not need to threaten her. The structure did that for him. Nora recognized the trap immediately. Signing would not protect her. It would neutralize her. Her identity would cease to be hers and become a liability the family managed. The questions she carried would no longer be dangerous because they would no longer be credible. She would not be killed. She would be archived. Inside the house, the pressure against Colt escalated in parallel. It did not appear as confrontation. It appeared as interference. His doctors received revised instructions from an external medical consultant he had never approved. Medication schedules shifted. Recovery assessments became conservative to the point of obstruction. He was encouraged to rest longer, to delegate more, to let others manage operational details while he healed. Security rotations changed without his authorization. Access to the server room required new clearance layers introduced under the justification of audit compliance. Logs were delayed. Reports arrived edited, polished, stripped of raw data. Someone was eroding his reach quietly. Ryan positioned himself as the solution. He took over public-facing responsibilities with enthusiasm, reassuring partners that continuity was assured. He spoke on Colt's behalf where silence had once been policy. He framed his involvement as temporary, necessary, respectful. Colt observed all of it without reacting immediately. Pain sharpened his patience. He saw the pattern clearly now. The shooting had not been an attempt to remove him permanently. It had been a test of resistance. The follow-up was structural. If he could be made irrelevant through procedure, there would be no need to finish him. Nora stood at the intersection of those strategies. To Ryan, she was leverage. To the system, she was a variable that could be stabilized through ownership. To Colt, she was both a risk and a mirror, someone whose presence exposed how thoroughly his house had been compromised. He intervened without ceremony. Doctors were dismissed and replaced. Security personnel who answered to secondary chains of command were reassigned overnight. Access protocols reverted to legacy structures that only he controlled. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Decisions were made unilaterally and enforced immediately. The house responded. Staff adjusted their behavior instinctively, recalibrating allegiance. The illusion of Colt's weakness dissolved quickly once he began acting. His authority had never been symbolic. It had simply been restrained. Ryan noticed. The tension between them surfaced not as argument, but as competition for legitimacy. Ryan pushed paperwork. Colt pushed action. Ryan framed narratives. Colt dismantled infrastructure. Nora watched it unfold with growing clarity. This was not about her safety. This was about control over the story she represented. If Ryan succeeded, she would disappear into documentation. If Colt prevailed, she would remain dangerous, unresolved, present. Neither outcome offered comfort, but one preserved agency. The contract was presented formally. It arrived with legal explanations, assurances, timelines. It was written to appear beneficial, even flattering. It offered stability, resources, protection from scrutiny. It promised an end to uncertainty. Nora read it carefully. Every clause that offered safety carried a corresponding silence. Every benefit required compliance. Every protection demanded exclusivity. The document did not restrict her body, it restricted her voice. Signing it would mean surrendering the last, uncontested part of herself. She did not refuse immediately. She delayed. That hesitation was its own decision. Colt did not urge her either way. He did not appeal to emotion or loyalty. He did not frame himself as her savior. He treated her as an independent actor whose choice would alter the battlefield regardless of his preference. That restraint mattered. Nora understood then that she was no longer deciding between men. She was deciding between states of existence. Object or participant. Asset or variable. The house on the hill had been built to process people into manageable forms. It turned lives into agreements, conflicts into clauses, violence into liability mitigation. The contract was simply its most honest expression. Nora chose not to sign. Not yet. And in that refusal, she crossed an invisible line. She was no longer a witness to a power struggle. She was part of it. Whatever happened next would not allow her to return to anonymity, dependency, or safe distance. The moment she rejected formal ownership, she became uncontrollable. And uncontrollable elements did not survive inside structures like this without alliances. For the first time since the fire, Nora allowed herself to consider that survival might not come from exposing Colt Hale. It might come from standing beside him long enough to dismantle what had tried to consume them both. The contract remained unsigned. But the offer had already changed the game. Because now everyone in the house understood the same thing. Nora Blake was no longer something to be erased quietly. She was something that had to be claimed, contained, or eliminated. And Colt Hale had just made it clear that he would not allow the first option to be decided without a fight. The takeover did not begin with guns. It began with documents. Ryan Hale moved the way people did when they believed law could be weaponized more cleanly than violence. By the time anyone in the house realized something had shifted, the shift had already been filed, stamped, copied, and forwarded. A chain of board resolutions appeared as if it had always existed. Emergency clauses activated. Temporary authority reassigned. Control of the foundation's assets, its security contracts, its data infrastructure, and its personnel was redirected through signatures that looked legitimate at a glance. The legitimacy was the point. Ryan did not need to win a war in the streets. He needed the structure to recognize him as its new center. He needed Colt Hale reduced from power to risk, from authority to liability. The language was clinical. Concerns about Colt's stability, medical incapacity, potential impairment following trauma, operational unpredictability, a duty of care clause invoked to justify removal for the safety of staff and partners. It was written to sound responsible, even compassionate. It was designed to isolate him without firing a shot. Colt felt it before it reached him formally. His access to internal systems slowed. Door codes he had used for years stopped responding. A call to one of his long-standing contacts went unanswered, not because loyalty had vanished, but because someone had blocked the line at the network level. His recovery reports, once delivered directly to him, began routing through a new administrative liaison assigned under Ryan's authority. The house began to obey someone else. It happened in small ways at first. A guard hesitated before letting Colt's man enter a corridor. A staff member avoided eye contact. A routine supply delivery was delayed because a new signature was required. Then it escalated. One evening, a power fluctuation rolled through the building as if the hill itself had exhaled. The upper floor lost electricity for exactly 7 minutes, enough time to reset electronic locks, Enough time to force manual overrides. Enough time to change codes without needing to answer questions. When the lights returned, a different order existed. Doors that had always been open to Colt's people required new clearance. Cameras in critical hallways displayed a static loop. The server room, once protected by layered authentication only Colt could authorize, now showed a lockout message. Access suspended pending compliance review. In the silence, the house did what it had always done. It adapted. Nora was the first to be contained. Not attacked, not bruised, not dragged screaming into a basement. Ryan understood the value of clean captivity. She was moved with polite insistence into a secure wing under the pretext of safety. The staff assigned to her were not hostile. That made it worse. Their demeanor framed her restraint as care. Her phone was taken for her protection. Her door was not locked visibly, but the hallway beyond it contained men whose posture communicated the truth. The windows opened toward the hill and the city's distant lights, beautiful and useless. She realized immediately what Ryan had done. He had not removed her as a threat. He had converted her into leverage. If Colt resisted, she would be the consequence. If Colt surrendered, she would become a controlled asset, folded into a narrative of rescue and gratitude. Nora understood the deeper intent. Ryan was not trying to kill her. He was trying to own the version of her that mattered. The survivor, the witness, the symbol. If he controlled her, he could control the story of the fire. If he controlled the story, he controlled the structure. The house had become a quiet siege. No sirens, no screaming, only changes in code, in access, in movement. Staff became cautious, waiting to see which authority would hold. Those with loyalty to Colt began to disappear into assigned duties or were quietly removed under procedural pretexts. People in uniform appeared who did not answer to Colt's chain of command and did not explain themselves. They did not need to. Their presence was explanation enough. Colt moved without hesitation. The moment the takeover became visible, he stopped playing at recovery. Pain was still present, but it was no longer the priority. He gathered the few who remained unquestionably loyal, men and women who were tied to him not by salary but by shared history. They did not ask questions. They did not demand proof. They recognized the pattern and adjusted accordingly. He did not attempt to negotiate with Ryan through formal channels. Formal channels were the trap. Instead, he went old. He reverted to analog systems Ryan could not easily counterfeit. Handwritten access lists. Physical keys stored in locations only Colt's inner circle knew. Secondary routes through the property that bypassed digital locks. Private contingencies built long before, when Colt had assumed someone inside his own family would eventually try to erase him. He also reached outward. Not to local police, not to politicians, not to anyone who benefited from the Foundation's quiet donations. He pushed information toward the only force that could not be bought as easily through contract language. Federal oversight with enough momentum to become uncontrollable. Aaron Murphy had already been circling the Foundation's records like a patient predator. The takeover gave her what she needed. It transformed suspicion into pattern. Emergency resolutions filed too quickly. Contractor IDs that did not match legacy databases. A sudden restriction of access to financial records under the guise of confidentiality. A rapid shift in authority that coincided with earlier anomalies connected to the factory fire's insurance settlements. To Aaron, it looked like panic disguised as governance. She accelerated the audit. Requests became subpoenas. Informal inquiries became formal demands. She expanded her scope beyond the Foundation to its linked entities. Shell companies, subcontractor networks, port storage agreements, private security contracts that functioned as cover for something older and darker. She did not move loudly. She moved efficiently. Inside the house, Nora waited. Containment created its own clarity. She listened for footsteps, for shifts in guard behavior, for the small signals that revealed who was confident and who was afraid. She understood now that her survival had always been conditional. She had been kept alive because her existence could be used. The fact did not weaken her. It hardened something. She no longer entertained fantasies of simple justice. The truth was not a confession offered freely. It was a mechanism, and mechanisms had to be broken at their joints. Ryan chose the moment he believed. He had one to show his power. He did not come to Nora with apology. He came with demonstration. He entered her secure wing as if it belonged to him. His confidence was polished, almost gentle. He stood within the radius of her containment and treated it like an achievement. He spoke of stability, of necessity, of the cost of leadership. The words were familiar, the kind successful men used to justify cruelty as strategy. He framed the fire as a business decision, an operation that removed obstacles and secured assets that could not be secured otherwise. He described it not with remorse but with pride, as if the scale of destruction proved capability. The motive emerged with cold clarity. The factory had not mattered as a factory. It had mattered as a location that contained a map, a routing schema, a set of warehouse and port corridor codes that made the difference between controlling contraband flows and merely competing for them. Whoever held those routes held leverage over shipping unions, over customs blind spots, over the city's invisible economy. Ryan had wanted the routes. The people inside had been collateral. He did not regret it because regret implied moral weight, and moral weight slowed momentum. He treated the deaths as a necessary purge, a cleansing of risk, a removal of witnesses. He spoke as if their humanity had never existed, only their inconvenience. Then he revealed the most brutal part. Nora had been kept alive intentionally. Not saved, not spared, preserved. A survivor was useful. A survivor could be pointed at an enemy when needed. A survivor could be used to validate forged documents, to anchor false narratives, to destabilize Colt by forcing him into a conflict where emotion could be exploited. Nora's identity had been rewritten not as mercy, but as inventory. Her clean papers, her reconstructed life, her placement in Colt's house had not been an accident. It had been planned. She had been positioned like a delayed weapon, a tool held in reserve until the moment it could be applied. Ryan admitted it the way someone admitted ownership, as if it proved superiority. For Nora, the confession did something devastating and clarifying. It did not soften her toward Colt. It did not absolve his system or the violence it contained, but it shattered the illusion that her enemy had been singular. Colt had been the visible face of power. Ryan had been the invisible engineer of its worst decisions. She understood now why the evidence had felt curated. The letter, the contract, the badge, all of it had been designed to steer her anger toward Colt, to make her burn the wrong man in public while the true architect secured control behind the scenes. The realization did not make her feel weak. It made her dangerous. Because once she saw the mechanism, she could no longer be manipulated by its simplest triggers. Outside her containment, the house tightened further. Security shifted positions. A new set of codes locked down critical wings. Power flickered again, less controlled this time, as if multiple hands were fighting over the same switches. The quiet siege began to tremble into instability. Colt moved. He breached the internal line not with brute force, but with timing. His loyalists disrupted the lock system from a secondary panel. A service stairwell opened. A corridor went dark for precisely the length of time needed to move someone through it unseen. The old architecture of the house, built for discretion, now served resistance. When Nora heard movement beyond her door, she did not hope. She prepared. She had already made the internal decision Ryan had tried to prevent. She would not become paper. She would not become someone else's storyline. She would not become a sanitized asset within a family brand. If she had to stand beside Colt Hale to break the structure that had preserved her as inventory, she would. Not out of forgiveness. Out of strategy. The takeover that Ryan believed would end the conflict had instead exposed the core. It revealed who had designed the fire, who had preserved the survivor, who had forged the closure. It revealed that the house on the hill was not merely compromised. It had been built with betrayal as an eventuality. And now betrayal had finally stepped into the light, confident enough to confess without remorse. That confidence would be its mistake. The light arrived without warmth. It came as paperwork that carried weight in the hand and weight in the city. Summonses printed on dense stock, notices with barcodes and case numbers, envelopes that made a dry rasp when opened, as if the paper itself resisted being read. It came as calendar entries that appeared on institutional systems without invitation, as access requests that could not be ignored, as quiet phone calls that contained no threats because they did not need them. It came through rooms where fluorescent panels hummed above polished steel, through server cages that breathed refrigerated air, through hallways that echoed with shoes that never hurried because authority never hurried. It was not the light of redemption or exposure meant to impress. It was the light of procedure, and procedure did not care who it hurt. Erin Murphy built the final move the way she had built every prior step, by refusing the narrative power preferred and forcing the narrative evidence could sustain. She did not pursue the house on the hill as a symbol. She dismantled the invisible architecture beneath it. She mapped the foundation first, then the companies attached to it like barnacles, then the contractors that pretended to be independent while sharing addresses, bank officers, payroll processors, and compliance consultants who recycled language across filings. She treated the structure as a circuit rather than a hierarchy. The goal was never to accuse loudly. The goal was to demonstrate design. The file became a living organism. It grew by accretion rather than revelation. One invoice could be dismissed as error. 10 invoices with identical rounding behavior could not. One deleted log entry could be explained as a malfunction. A repeating deletion window aligned with security outages became intent. Erin pulled backups that were never meant to be read, requested retention archives no one expected an auditor to understand, compared timestamps across systems built to disagree by design. She photographed paper ledgers that smelled of old ink and dust, then matched those numbers to digital transfers labeled with cleaner names. She asked for procurement packets, then asked again when they arrived incomplete, then asked for the missing attachments until the missing attachments became the evidence. She built the spine of the timeline and locked it in place through cross-confirmation. The fire at the illegal factory was no longer a rumor or a tragedy passed between survivors. It became a plotted event. The insurance payout ceased to be compensation and revealed itself as fuel. The sudden appearance of a logistics subsidiary was no longer expansion, but camouflage. The replacement of an entire security team 2 weeks after the fire was no longer routine staffing. It was containment. The charitable grant that arrived the same quarter was no longer generosity. It was a wash cycle. Each fact could stand alone, and yet each pointed in the same direction. Complexity stopped being a shield and became the proof. The light did not originate in a single courtroom, but the court became the lens that concentrated it. Motions were filed in parallel jurisdictions to prevent the slow suffocation of delay. Subpoenas reached banks, port authorities, payroll vendors, insurers, private security registries, and the outside accounting firm that had polished the foundation's annual reports. A judge signed an order, and that order became a key that opened doors sealed by money for years. Imaging teams copied servers bit by bit, preserving not only what remained, but what had been overwritten. Forensic accountants reconstructed flows from fragments, building a river out of droplets. Once the river existed, everyone near it understood they could drown. Conference rooms filled with people who had never been questioned under oath. They sat beneath flags and framed seals and learned that reputation did not translate into immunity. Procedure did not care about fundraisers or speeches. It cared about signatures, metadata, authorization trails, and the quiet rhythm of transactions. Erin presented the case without drama. She let inevitability do the work. Colt Hale did not attempt innocence. Innocence was not his currency, and claiming it would only invite someone to dismantle him for sport. He did not approach Erin as a supplicant or the federal apparatus as an enemy. He treated it as weather. He redirected it, seeded it, ensured it could not be controlled by a single hand. He distributed evidence into multiple reservoirs at once, the way he once distributed risk, mirrored drives delivered through intermediaries, encrypted packets placed where sudden seizures could not erase them, notarized chains of custody stored outside the state. He understood that truth died when it had one owner. He also applied pressure where it mattered. The board that had obeyed Ryan's paperwork now faced individualized exposure. Colt supplied documentation showing which directors signed which emergency resolutions, who authorized consulting payments that were not consulting, who accepted benefits disguised as reimbursements. He showed timelines of attendance and absence, unanimity and coercion. He did not offer mercy. He offered the shape of fear. Survival became a solitary calculation. The system began to consume itself. Gala smiles drained under deposition lighting. Compliance officers abandoned rehearsed language and began to over-explain, filling silence with panic. Lawyers requested private meetings, then limited representation, then immunity. A financial officer suddenly remembered objections never recorded. A security manager blamed a subordinate who had already vanished. Emails written in the shorthand of confidence surfaced and became legible once stripped of context that no longer existed. Ryan Hale tried to stabilize the collapse by performing control. He convened meetings, issued memos, framed the situation as misunderstanding and overreach. But his tools belonged to shadow. In shadow, one could threaten, reward, delete. Under formal light, every action left a trail. Calls were logged, calendars subpoenaed, account movements flagged. Attempts to relocate funds triggered automatic reports. Loyalty, once purchased, turned brittle when protection looked uncertain. Allies withdrew with surgical politeness. Responses were delayed. Advice turned cautious. Contracts dissolved under neutral language. Ryan understood too late that control had always been rented. The rent had increased. The light made secrecy impossible to afford. Nora remained outside the spectacle by choice, but not untouched. Even unseen, she felt the city converting her into a symbol. Her name appeared in documents she never read. Her history was summarized in sterile paragraphs that erased smell and sound. The fire became an incident. The dead became casualties. Her survival became an anomaly. She learned the cruelty of formal language. It made horror manageable. She reclaimed her name away from it. It happened in small, disciplined moments when she stopped waiting for validation. She stopped needing contracts, marriage, permission, apology. She accepted that what had been done to her could be proven but not undone. The light would expose the mechanism, not repair the damage. Repair, if possible, would be internal and slow. The evidence she delivered was not theatrical. It was exact. A physical artifact paired with digital correlation. A security tag linked to a subcontractor code, matching a warehouse route map altered days before the fire. Analysts confirmed the match. The identifier appeared in port access logs, in a private terminal, aligned with unregistered container movement. The same identifier surfaced later in procurement ledgers as an equipment disposal entry with suspicious neatness. The artifact tied past crime to present commerce. It forced the case into the present tense. When Nora handed it over, there was no triumph. only the hollow calm of recognition. The circle closed. The space inside it stayed cold. The house on the hill remained. Institutions rarely collapsed theatrically. They adapted, rebranded, replaced faces, learned new scripts. The city absorbed scandal the way it absorbed weather and moved on. Colt could no longer hide behind fatigue. Exposure demanded clarity. He became explicit in what he was and what he controlled. Redemption was never offered. Endurance was required. Nora could no longer disappear. Records created visibility, and visibility demanded boundaries rather than secrecy. Anonymity had been a cage. Visibility was risk under different rules. Their connection did not heal. It did not soften. It remained an alliance forged by shared exposure and refusal to vanish. They did not promise peace. They understood that truth was not medicine. It was a condition. And under that condition, the city continued to smell of rain on concrete and warm metal beneath streetlights, indifferent to cost, asking no one what the truth had taken to exist. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.